Thank you so much for attending the 16th Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity. Now we will going to begin toward regional cooperation for the establishment of a peace region on the Korean Peninsula. I will going to introduce today's chairman. The chairman, Jeon Byung-gun, is the Senior Research Fellow in Korea Institute for National Unification and received his PhD in Political Science in Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. And I will going to hand over the microphone to the Professor Jeon Byung-gun. Good afternoon. I am Jeon Byung-gun, the Senior Research Fellow in Korea Institute for National Unification. A path toward peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula has increasingly become riddled with obstacles, and specifically, the internal condition of North Korean development and external conditions for the development should be analyzed, and it is time for us to discuss the proper resolution. So today we have two speakers and we have 4 panelists who we're going to discuss in this session. Before we start, I will going to introduce 2 speakers and 4 panelists. The first speaker is Professor Lee-Ju-hun from Midwestern State University, and he will going to give us a presentation about non-traditional security cooperation in East Asia and North Korea's developmental model. Professor Lee is an assistant professor of political science at Midwestern State University. He studies environmental politics, disaster resilience, and social capital in the East Asian region and beyond. The second speaker is senior researcher at the Seongkyungwan University for Global Strategy. Researcher Kang Chae-yeon had received her doctorate in politics in Seongkyungwan University, and her main area of research interest are North Korean political economy. She is actually from North Korea, so she has a lot of knowledge in terms of the condition of North Korea. And I will going to briefly introduce 4 panelists of today's session. The first panelist is Professor Kim Yutar at Dokdong University, and he focuses on global governance, U.S.-China relations, and he is a scholar who is very expected in the future. The second panelist is Mr. Kim Soo-am, Senior Research Fellow at Korea Institute for National Unification. And he is studying the human rights, humanitarian assistance toward North Korea, and he has a lot of experience in this field. The third panelist, Director Lee Jae-young from Korean Institute for National Unification, received his doctorate at the Seoul National University, Graduate School of International Studies. The last panelist is Deputy Director Ming-Shi Choi at the Center for Korean Peninsula Studies, Shandong University. Can you hear us? He is connected online from China. Professor Choi received his PhD from Northeast Asian Studies College of Jilin University. His current research interests are inter-Korean relations. we don't have enough time, so we will going to have the session with two speakers giving presentation for 15 minutes each. And after their presentation, the panelists will going to have about 7 minutes, and we will going to have a Q&A session afterwards. For a smooth operation, I will try my best. Now let's have the first
이종 교수님께 마이크를 넘기겠습니다.
Professor Lee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Joan Lee, and I'm going to have a presentation about non-traditional security cooperation in East Asia and North Korea's developmental model. So, today we have another presentations about the Korean situations and others. So today I'd like to focus on the North Korean issues in relation with the outside environment and also the external conditions or the successful cases. So I think the behaviors and activities of these people in East Asia is my focus of study, especially what kind of influence or the impact they are experiencing. And also for that, I want to have a presentation in more general view and focusing on non-traditional security cooperation. So firstly, I'd like to have a brief introduction about non-traditional security threats. It means that it doesn't pose a direct threat to the existence of the state, like war. That's what we call the traditional security threats. However, non-traditional security threat means that it doesn't pose a direct threat to the existence of the state, like traditional security threats. But it has a serious adverse effect on protecting the people and also consume resources. That's what we call non-traditional security threats, including environmental pollution. So in the perspective of the Korean government, we can talk about the yellow dust or nuclear issues or the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are the representative examples of non-traditional security threats. One of the key features of non-traditional security threats is they cannot resolve by one country's efforts. We have to make a common goal and general effort to solve those issues. So here I'd like to talk about cooperation between countries because it requires regional cooperations and national cooperations. When we review all those cooperation, we can see the flow. So in general, we can take a security approach or non-security approach at the same time. So in terms of non-security approaches, we can think of norms, identities, economic interests, and etc. So we can appeal those like items in order to induce cooperations. So based on the experts or the control context, we can proceed with non-security approaches at a very high level cooperations. But there are still a lot of difficulties to do those non-security approaches, and this is the global trend, not only here but also for the European environment as well. So like for the global governments, what cannot be included in the security? Will there be those items that cannot be included in the national security? So as we all hear, every key issue is related with the national security, even for food, environment, culture, and many things are related with security. So the security itself, if you put security as its frame, we can attract more attentions and induce more cooperation. We are not sure if it is true or not, but that's the way you're proceeding with the environment and global issues. And that's why I am taking an approach in this perspective. In terms of the security approach as well, we can think of subcategories. So first thing is new issues like environmental issues can be included to the traditional national security. So it was the case in Finland or Germany. So when you review all those literatures published in those countries, they approach environmental issue as a major issue for the security. So in that regard, we assigned Helsinki agreements or the others. So for their national security, environment is one of the key agenda, and it is also related with the national identity and its sovereignty. So it can do harm for other countries' natural resources. So they regard environmental issue as the sovereignty issue at first. So it is related to the security issue from this scratch. However, there's a problem with this approach because those agreements state that those new items are the threat to the national identity and sovereignty, but unlike other military issues or defense issues, they are really proactive. There's no proactive motion for those issues. Against that background, and during the 1990s, we can see a new concept which is called universal human security. So this is stated by the UN, telling that we have to hand down good environment to the future generations. So in that regard, it is related with the security and promoted in that way, and it made a partial success. So for the Kyoto Conventions or the other Paris agreements, because it could lead those results. So it is partial, but still it was successful cases and made a very good case for the successful agreement. And lastly, we can think of the very recent concept and the trend for the security, which is extended national security. So the concept of security itself has been changed, so it can be extended or the exclusive national security. So in that regard, we can cover all the concept of government, resilience, meta governance, and other new concepts. So it is managing all the risk factors compared to the traditional national security, and it is the current trend of the approaches for regional cooperations. And those trends are quite obvious in the European nations. And against the backdrop, I'd like to talk about European nations because European nations tend to focus on traditional national securities, but recently they changed their attitude to the extended national security and universal human securities. In that process, they showed their advancement. However, in East Asia, mostly we are focusing on most cooperative bodies are the members of the UN. So we, under the lead of the UN, we are taking the approach of the universal human security. Also, they are led by the allies. So we have very few experience relate those issues for the traditional national security. Mostly we are connecting those issues to the non-security approaches, but we are now making some advancements gradually. So in East Asia, regional cooperations, especially for the environment, is now making a very drastic leap because the process to connect them to the national securities was lacking. So I like to recall the concept of the traditional national security. I'm not telling that we have to go back to the traditional national security approach. However, at the governance, we have to induce this lower level governance to the higher level governance. But in order to do so, we have to connect it to the traditional national security. Without that, we cannot go up to the higher level of the governments, especially in the East Asia regions. So extended national security and the universal human security and the traditional national security should create a virtual cycle in order to make that higher level approaches of cooperations. That's what we have to discuss more and find solutions to address those issues. And another reason that I'm insisting this is based on the analysis of many cases. Like we're saying very easily, we can think of the functionality of the European nations. If you can succeed to have function in one sector, it can lead to other sectors. So if you could successfully achieve the result from the military sectors, it can spread to other sectors. So there are many some mechanisms are reported for the successful cases, but they are not reported for all. But still, these goals can be achieved if we eliminate threats. So it is a side result of the removal of the threats. So that is, it doesn't mean that if we remove all the threat factors, we can achieve these goals. So the specific mechanism has not been verified yet. So for cooperation with North Korea and cooperation with East Asia, if we do some cooperation in the environment sectors with North Korea, we can have a vague expectation that we can have a cooperation in those sectors with North Korea, but it cannot be the one imminent trigger to achieve our goal. So we have to make more efforts to connect those issues close to each other. So with KINU, I analyze a lot of successful cases in Europe and other regions, and that's what I'm studying at the moment. So in European nations, even from the beginning, they included environmental sectors for their national security and doing a lot of studies and researches. And for the East Asia councils, we can see a number of councils which is on making and which is already established. And part of councils are making a concrete result. But in general, members are still stagnant while they cannot go up to the higher level. But we can see some successful cases, including TEMM, which means Tripartite Environment Ministers meetings, or the Asian agreement, or the Mekong agreement. So those cases are good examples that we made a leap from the before. So from before, we have a possibility or the potential to be developed as inclusive or the extended council. So I'd like to talk about this more if I have opportunity later. And the features of the Northeast Asian cooperation is, as I already mentioned, except for the Tripartite Environment Ministers meeting, TEMM, most are led by UNEP or the related bodies. So they are making approaches in the human security. So even for the TEMM meetings, it was led by UN. So we cannot say there's no influence from UN. And also, the other feature is that there's no they are not legally binding. And so far, when there is an issue, bilateral cooperation has been more effective in solving problems than multilateral cooperation. And the other interesting feature is that in the case of Korea, there's a tendency to focus on cooperation between 3 Northeast Asian countries. Most of the operations was proposed by Korea. But in the case of Japan, there's a little difference. There's a strong tendency to encompass all of East Asia. So all the activities led by Japan, they encompass all East Asia and the broader region. And they are making efforts to cover bigger regions than Korea. In case of China, they are quite passive in regional cooperations. So while China is making very proactive efforts to join the global cooperations, but they're passive in regional cooperation. In case of North Korea, they participate. However, they are really passive in information sharing. So it is hard to judge North Korea with only with information they provided. And because of the time limit, I'll proceed a little quickly. So then, against this backdrop, how can we make North Korea participate to the regional cooperation more actively? Well, actually, we are in a very difficult situation. But we first have to think about the threat factors, including environments and the others. So we have to make a practical, successful case to address these issues. So we can start from the small-scale success and build trust first to go to bigger goals. Also, we have to make separated approach from the traditional military national security agenda. Like while we're making communications about environmental issues, we cannot assume that they can lead to the political stability, including the unifications. So if we make that kind of effect, we can rather have the side effect or the adverse effect. So like the leader Kim Jong-un mentioned, non-essential issues cannot influence essential issues because we have to think about the key national interests and distinguish them from the non-essential issues. So we cannot make high expectations on solving environmental issues alone. That's what I want to highlight. And also, we need to create conditions to expand North Korea's role in the international community. And if possible, we can also participate in the global climate change cooperations. Currently, North Korea is not participating in cooperation global climate change, but we can induce them to participate in that cooperation because North Korea is also willing to do so. And also, we can review of Indonesian case related to Asian Agreement on transboundary haze pollution because it is one of the successful cases that we can think of and consider. And also, we can make attempts to make private organizations to participate in these regional cooperations. There are more slides on presentation, but I'd like to wrap up my presentation at the moment, but I'll take questions later at the session. Thank you very much. I feel sorry for not giving you enough time, but we're going to have another opportunity to make your point later. Mr. Lee, talk about the regional cooperation in East Asia. So with those theoretical and the practical cooperations, we need to review the possibility and the potential that the North Korea participation. On this topic, we can have more time to discuss at the panelist session. And then later, and now we're going to have a presentation from Chae Young-gang.
Good afternoon, I am Kang Chae-yeon. Through the non-traditional development cooperation, we have saw how we can cooperate and the model of the cooperation. But in North Korea, they have plan and state in coexistence. And I wonder what kind of model we should have for the cooperation in the future. This is the reason why I have came up with this theme, coexistence of North Korea state and market and a sustainable development model. So far, we have asked how to make North Korea develop. And can North Korea open their market? Can North Korea actually develop? And if we trace back all those traces, we find out what we are lacking of, what they are lacking of, and what kind of resolution we should take. That's the thing that we have wondered. And these are the contents. Marketization from below and state-run reform, weak political and administrative system at market formation stage, and we can see what kind of measures can be taken and what kind of changes had been done here. And if there is a change, Kim Jong-un's administration and his regime is actually playing a puzzle. They are matching puzzles, and this shows the development. Marketization from below and formation stage, expansion stage. In 2010, marketization from below and formation stage had started in 2010 and it had finished in 2010. North Korea had faced economic difficulties and they were discussing some of the issues, and there were black markets born, and the first attacked market was the consumable market. So in that situation, North Korea had made some attempts in 1998 to make some coordination and adjustment. So in this situation, consumable market had developed and labor market started. So by the time when they started some of the markets, we have witnessed to some financial markets and other service markets. So for North Korea, they have done some corporate structuring and they have tried changing the cabinet, and they are starting the new economy, and now they have introduced in 2003 the public market. So how they make the national corporate grow and at the same time but vitalize the market. Non-traditional sector such as light industry, they should accept the market system. So there were some mistakes and there were some difficulties. So that's how they have introduced the public market and they have made various attempts. So now their new attempts, these have error and they know that now. So after they make mistakes in 2000 and the fact that they have introduced market was wrong, but so in 2004 2005 they had restricted market after that judgment, and in 2010 the North Korea should realize that they should revive market, so the nation had permitted market. So starting from 2010, Kim Jong-un started taking over the regime. So plan market coexistence. This emphasize basic plan. And the economy plan and the measure, those have errors, and they all acknowledge those errors, and they had made attempts to modify those errors. So how the market and plan can coexist, many experts had made some research in this field, and they are trying to find out what is the best change that can make. And this is the reason I have chose this theme. In some kind of reformation and change, this had been done by the state in a big scale. they were trying to maintain the plan, so they had to enhance the volume of the agricultural produce. So at the beginning of the China, it was very similar, excessive planned amount of imposed on sub-teams. And this also failed. So UN, FAO, or other international organization had made another attempt. And after the public corporates had went bankrupt and local administration did not help with that, Kim Jong-un's regime took the place. And starting from this time, corporate restructuring, the governmental structure had changed, so they realized that it was very difficult to do all the attempts at one time. So that is the reason they were trying to revise the law and revise the income payment system. And after that, they have dismantled United Enterprises. So they just focused on metal, coal instead. So in 2000, former President Kim Dae-jung had visited Pyongyang, and that is the time when the United Enterprises were revived. They have restored those United Enterprises, and it was very much confusing. So in 2002, July, economic measures were done. So the corporates were given with the autonomy, and those sub-team management system had been downsized with smaller number of workers, and this is the way how they have made some reform. And there were some price reform also. They have raised 40% of income, and taxation were introduced to farmers. And if we look at the intention of North Korea in early 2000, the coexistence of plan and market was systemized, but what was important was what had been dismantled in 1970s had restored. Financial system had been reformed, commercial bank, central bank had been separated. So commercial bank law were enacted. But in 2000, that also went failure. In Kim Jong-un's administration, if we look at these failures, in my perspective, what kind of economic measures and how that went to failure, they are monitoring those failures. They have concerned and they have thought about how this can be connected to the economic development. So their expertise, their economic expertise had been expanded. What is the expansion of economic expertise? It means hiring more people with expertise. If you don't have expertise, you cannot work for the government. And this had been progressed very fast. And starting from 2020, the government officials should have scientific knowledge, so that's the reason why they are learning more. And what is important is that decentralization, this is the characteristic of Kim Jong-un's administration. Separating the government of local and central is the key of their government measure. And separating the government and making and developing the local government, supplementing technology and human resources to local government. And they also came up with the special high school system. Strengthening the responsibility of decentralization, this was followed by policy such as science technology policies. In 2014, the socialist corporate first came out, but while they were implementing it, the socialist economy did not play well. So in 2000, when Chairman Kim Jong-un said that they failed with their strategy, they tried to emphasize the responsibility of the socialism, but during that time, their strategic factors had made some confusion, so that is the reason why it was very difficult to implement. So this year, they revised those policies. So socialist corporate responsibility system, I will going to explain you this through my table. But since we're running out of time, socialist corporate responsibility system, the new sub-team management, some of the garden field had been divided, and those garden fields had been designated to small farmers, and small farmers took the responsibility of growing agricultural product in these fields, and this is very similar to the measures done by China's government. And I think Kim Jong-un's regime is following the similar measure, and this is now implemented right now. And starting from 2018, economic responsibility system had first came up, and this is also implemented right now. And after a few years, we will see how it will be developed or reinforced in the future. But in terms of privatizing, the state is not permitting any kind of privatization, but they have their own way to privatize. And those ways are now settled. And in 1980s, Perestroika's policy also included unofficial privatization, and there were signs of those privatization, and this is now also reproduced by the business owners in North Korea. Sustainable development strategy should be developed, and I am working on it right now. Reform policies so far, and more detailed reform policy. Privatization can be made into a system by Kim Jong-un's regime, and what is very important is that UN's SDG North Korea is very much interested with the SDG. They are trying to learn, they are trying to participate in this process. So through their planning, they can see new plan, new reform, new opening. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
네. 강채연 박사님께서는
Okay, Chae-young
내부의 시장화 과정을
just had a presentation about the marketization process in the 1990s in North Korea. And also I made an explanation about the macro development of the market. Because we are talking about the broad view of the marketization of North Korea, we are running out of time. But I hope that we can have an opportunity to talk about it more in detail later. So after we just had 2 presentations, and now we're going to have discussion sessions with our panelists. So let us begin our panelist discussion. So firstly, Professor Kim and Dr. Kim will have a discussion about the first presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Yutar Kim. And first of all, thank you for the great presentations. So I was asked to make a comment on the first presentation, which was made by Joo-hwan Lee. So if necessary, I'd like to hear additional comments and have further discussions. So first of all, the general goal or the background is as we are having very difficult situation for the North Korea and South Korea relations, or now we are facing the paradox in the East Asia. So all the situations are really stagnant and difficult. So under this circumstance, what will be the viable or the effective topic for agenda for the cooperations? And based on that, what kind of dialogue background we can establish? I believe Mr. Lee, Professor Lee just gave an answer for that question. So as a result, the topic of the presentation was that if we securitize this environmental issue as a security issue, so securitization means that turning our non-traditional security threat to the traditional security threat, which was the core idea of the Helsinki Agreement. So before the post-Cold War period, between the national securities, all the factors can be included into non-traditional security threats. So, and the other experts saying that we can categorize them into the security threats, environmental issue, climate issue, and the other issues sectors. So those non-traditional security threats can be included into traditional security threats, and now we are making an effort in that way. So if we approach environmental agendas under the security threat agenda, we can facilitate establishing a regime on the region. So in particular, for the 3 countries in Asia, East Asia, including Korea, China, and Japan, can build a regime first, and then we can induce North Korea to participate. So we can create conditions first. I think it will be a desirable way, and Professor Lee just did a literature review on that approach. And for that, we need to review some parts and issues. So we need to have a thorough review on that approach. And in my perspective, I think it is viable enough and possible approach. And there are 2 options. If we have to choose one out of 2 options, of course, I believe the result or the effect would be more favorable if we take that into security frame. But still, we have a lot of issues and items to review. So this should be very pragmatic research to review or to verify of the effects of the security, and only few researches has been made on that approach. And in that idea, for the methodology, I am not 100% sure of it. still, there are a lot of external platforms where that it is making efforts to make securitization, like for the UN Security Council and the other like bodies from the UK, and even the developing countries are making like connection between the environmental issues and the security issues, and they're creating those nexus, and they're raising environmental issue from the security framework. In case of UK and the US, they are making domestic security reports and also included climate change into the agenda. So they are specify environmental issue in those security reports. So for the political or the practical perspective or the level, all those securitization of non-traditional security factors are ongoing and making. But in terms of the building regime for the national site, does it really provide favorable environment for countries? But for that question, we couldn't get any specific or the concrete answer. And theoretically approach, a lot of like experts or the scholars are criticizing that there are other non-traditional security threats, like including cyberspace threats. There are some like representative accidents that we can consider it as a security threat. Like if there are like representative or the obvious like terrorism groups in those sectors, and as a result, we can include those like agendas to the security agendas, and it is a natural process. And in terms of the political response, it can naturally relate it to the traditional Ministry of Defense. So we can expand the organization to include those non-traditional security threats, including cyberspace. However, when it comes to environmental issues, it's really difficult to do so because there's no like obvious or the visible threat or security threats. Of course, it is an important issue, but still the background or the evidence is not enough. That's my perspective. That there are some perspective in that way. And recently, there's the social like discourse or the dialogue of the environmental like pollutions or the climate changes are focusing on the apocalypse or the end of the world. Of course, it can be a reasonable optimism because climate change issue is significant and critical issue, but also there are a lot of environmental technology in terms of the response or the adaptation. So all those related technologies are developed very rapidly. And based on a number of reports about the environmental like pollutions and the climate change scenarios, it doesn't mean that our environment or the climate will be worsened or exacerbated, like it can go over like 4 Celsius degree or so. Even from the Paris Agreement, the worst case will be 3 Celsius degree, and we can prevent this end. And there are a number of different like perspectives, like for example, Michael Salenberg. In that case, should we like securitize the environmental issue to the traditional security threats? And because of the time like conflicts, we will wrap up your discussion shortly. So in that regard, for the alternative idea, we can propose we can think of an environmental CONESCOV, which means the higher income the state has, the better response they can have. So in case of East Asia, Korea, Japan, and China has already passed the like line, and they have enough strength to support other countries. Based on the Paris Agreement as well, they're like highlighting that we have to make a joint response to the environmental issues, including CVID. So those joint and the solidarity will be a key point to address these issues. And for the support or the cooperation of those three countries and the induced in North Korea and Mongolia can be a very important agenda for the regional cooperation in East Asia. Thank you very much.
네. 시간은 좀 많지 않기 때문에
Since we don't have enough time,
7분 정도 되는데 조금 지켜주고
please stick to your 7 minutes limit. Next, I will give you the microphone to Dr. Kim. So, if you have any agendas that you want to touch upon, this is your chance to speak. Thank you very much. I am Kim Soo-han from KINU. I will going to point out some of the issues.
Professor Lee just mentioned about the expansion of the cooperation and the security approaches. I believe the key of the security is the cause of the threats and where does threat comes and how we can respond to those threats. So we were used to have a national security approach in terms of the national defense or the military approaches. And also for the environmental issues and the pandemics or the infectious diseases, we are now developing and expanding the concept to the non-traditional security threats. And I believe Professor Lee had explained that really well. And based on that, we could think of how we can connect those ideas with the developmental method for the North Korea. But still, I have as my personal perspective, we can think about the national security, which is highly focusing on the military threats. My question is how we can make a foundation to make the turn or the shift between the traditional and the non-traditional threats, and how can we minimize the downcomes. And the core will be the strategic competition between the US and China. And actually, it is going beyond the military sector, even up to the economic sectors. In terms of the reality on the Korean Peninsula, because of the Cold War situation, traditional national security is dominating all the threats. So, as a matter of essential and non-essential issues, essential issues may include the hostile policy from the US against the North Korea, and it should be removed. And then they can make a next step. But based on the reality of the South Korea, military security should be the precondition of the non-traditional security threat, and that will be the key point for the agendas and the questions. So that is the side effects or the adverse effect of the traditional military security threats have on non-traditional security threats. And for those conditions, 3 countries, including China, Korea, and Japan, they are now having a very small scale of cooperations. In that case, while all those countries has a different perspective, how can we lead or induce cooperative attitudes from other countries, including China and Japan? And also, how can we induce China to have approaches of non-traditional security threats? Actually, the U.S. is insisting that all those preconditions should be addressed first, but still, North Korea is very weak to solve those issues, but they are open to non-traditional security threats. So East Asia as well as the Asian and their private organizations, we can lead and expand the regional cooperation with North Korea. And I think worthwhile to think about it. And lastly, we can connect North Korea with non-traditional security threats as well as
SDG after UN Assembly, North Korea is very active and very positive about this. However, COVID-19 is stopping them to make any assessment and document results related to this. So based on this SDG, we can build cooperation framework with the North Korea, and there are some factors with this direction. And in this part, like Professor Lee pointed out, traditional as approach and non-traditional approach had been emphasized. But for UN and UN North Korea team, they all have strategic framework in 2017 and 2021. Value norm and the expansion of this can make their cooperation, and North Korea had emphasized that through the traditional. But what I am focusing on is that what was security issue, human security, food security, these human security issue, which is non-traditional security, we can build cooperation on this. But other than that, the cooperation between North Korea and South Korea, what I have pointed out before, the essential North Korean measure, I think this should be resolved on somewhat level so that we can take another measure. But if we look at the Korean Peninsula, there are some of the measures that can be taken beyond the level of the nation. And lastly, this is not my research sector, but you have mentioned about the responsibility management system. Yes, I can understand that, but you have mentioned about the sub-team management and team management, and this is very much similar to the plan of China. And is this related to nation's policy? And this is giving a great deal of autonomy to each management system. But if this does not work in the sub-management team, what will be the resolution? Thank you very much. We will have Professor Lee.
Okay. We could have great comment from the other panelists. So I'd like to deliver on the key agendas of my discussions.
Dr. Kang had made some of the points what kind of reform had been made in North Korean policy, but I have a question in this. I majored in China policy, and so that is the reason why I'm focusing on China. Through this systematic reformation, is there any driving force that is pushing the reform? Because when you first introduce the system, there can be failure because of lacking driving force. So is there any power that is pushing this reform? And I really want to know if there is. And for Kim Jong-un, like Deng So-pyong in China, they have a blueprint. I mean, do they have a blueprint like Deng Xiaoping? And I want to know about the speed and direction of reform. Northeast Asia or Central Asia, they are successful because of the radical reform, but there are also failures. And after the failure, some of the countries had to go through recession. So China and Vietnam, they went slow reform. That is the reason why some of those regions were successful with the reform. So I want to know, between fast and slow reform, what kind of speed is North Korea trying to take. I need more explanation in this. And lastly, when we think about development model in North Korea is facing sanctions and COVID-19 situation, so there is no opening at all right now. So internally, if there is reformation, is there any room for development? And in a low development era, is there any way to escape this situation? So in that respect, what North Korea should do, the contents of reform, the specific and systematic aspect should not be emphasized, but rather approaching with what kind of procedure, what kind of measure should be taken. I think this should be more emphasized. So representatively, when
경우에 이제 그 심천
China first opened their market, they had came up with very successful model. This model was not about, it was Shincheon model, very small village in China. It is about developing a very poor, very underdeveloped village first. So after their development, this development project had been assessed as a successful project. So I think North Korea,
들이 있는지
I want to know if there is any reform open development model, and I hope this can be connected. I know that you want to link this to other model, other the successful model, but if that does not work, maybe we can think about taking Shincheon model for their development process. And lastly, like Professor Kang had explained,
국가가
state-led project, there are many various market powers that are stopping the development, and there are some corruptions, and those corruptions are stopping the speed of development. And I want to know what kind of effect is given to those development in North Korea. But for cases in China, China is controlling these corruptions on their way, and there were some measures taken in that respect. So in that respect, I want to know what kind of relationship the North Korean government is planning in this situation.
Thank you for the great comments. So to review about the potential of the development model for the North Korea, we believe that we can have great implication from the Chinese case. In that regard, Choi Ming-si professor can make a great comments on this issue. I'm sorry for the limited time, but I'd like to hear your opinion. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So first, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to this meaningful event. So as researcher Kong, I'd like to make a comment on the second presentation. So it is about the relationship of
Because of the time limit and space limit, I will be short. I will choose and focus. And when we first look at the presentation, you have mentioned about coexistence of plan and market, and you are trying to find out the sustainable development model of North Korea, and I think this is your theme of your presentation. But if you look at the first part, marketization from below and reformation of public sector. But if we look at the presentation file, marketization from below had been mentioned. I know that the process of marketization and marketization starting from below is also important. I know that. But if you want to explain the marketization of North Korea, maybe the full-size explanation is more appropriate. And in Kim Jong-un's regime, in the process of North Korea's marketization, government's policy maybe government policy is very much important in this marketization. So I think marketization from up, from the top, maybe this can be also appropriate. And if that is possible, like you have mentioned, the marketization of North Korea, we don't know which is more effective, from the top or from below. I want to know your opinion. How do you see this controversy? And my second question is that the question that I have been having for a long time. In 2021 January, there were some issues in North Korea. The economy is getting more difficult, so some of the power from North Korea is saying that they need to open and then they need to expand the market. But there are other sides that are emphasizing the opposite. I want to know your opinion, doctor, and in the relationship between reform and market, do you think the marketization of North Korea is outside the reform, or are you seeing the marketization of North Korea are included in the reform? And the last question is very much inclusive. And if there is no North Korean sanction, you have mentioned the coexistence of state and market in North Korea, then will there be a way to open the market, and what kind of market positioning will be necessary if this happens? And this is the end of my question. Thank you very much.
네.
Okay,
이상으로
so
오늘의 발표와
we just finished 2 presentations and the discussion with 4 panelists.
토론자분들의 의견과
We could hear a number of various comments and questions from the panelists, so I'd like to ask the presenters to prepare answers.
혹시 플로어에서
So before that, I'd like to ask if there's any question from the floor or from the audience. So if you have, please make it very briefly. So if you have, please raise your hand and make a question.
네, 감사합니다. 제주평화
Thank you very much.
강채영 박사님께
I have a question to Dr. Kang.
제가 이제 박사님 발표를 통해
So after listening to your presentation, I think the North Korea is on its way for marketization and for the open trade or the open market. So is it a reversible approach, not going back to the self-reliance market? So what is the level of marketization that North Korea has been pursued and achieved? I'd like to
정도에 이르렀다고 생각하시나요?
hear the level of the reformation that the North Korea has made to its market. And on top of that,
근본적인 문제가
the basis problem of the North Korea, was it from the military government or was it from the intervention from the external conditions? Or is it from the strengthening of bureaucratic systems inside the North Korea? Well, by strengthening the bureaucratic systems, is there any potential for North Korea to open the market? And is there any question from the floor? So if there's not, we'd like to hear answers. So the answers will be made from Dr. Kang first. I will give you 3 minutes.
I have about 3 minutes and I have to answer 3 different questions. I will be short. I will go backward. You have mentioned about reform and opening, and you have asked me if the North Korea had given up self-reliance. The clear thing is that we did not open. They did not open, or they did not marketize, and they are finding their way in a way of self-reliance. And some of the learning effect is showing up. And through that, China, Singapore, and Vietnam, they are choosing what is appropriate. And at the 8th meeting in North Korea, if we look at the direction, I think you should think what will come next. Yes, of course, military is also intervening some of the policies. So what is important? Europe, China, and other countries, they also opened the market. It is very similar, but we are still different. The problem is, for a short time, the power of control is intervening too much. And if there is too much control, if the level of control is high, then it will be abnormal. It will be difficult to have a structure with reform. So in that respect, after 2010, Kim Jong-un's regime, from the external perspective, it will look like a reform. What is necessary for market institution, they have all it's necessary. They have reform for tax, economy, law, corporate, ownership related. They have enacted all the necessary items that are necessary for reform, but they will going to open the market, but not now. Maybe those can be downsized in the future. Those physical institutions will be downsized, like China, anti-corruption institution. If China is emphasizing the economy, labor, even though I have the right to become, I won't volunteer. If the local government change, the central government will also change. The knowledge and economic foundation is necessary if you want to do something. So for 3 or 4 years, you will have to track the interesting results. For the development model with China, if we compare it with China, China had started reform starting from the small villages. And through Putku policy, they had opened their market. And through that experience, socialism, market economy had been built. The difference between North Korea and China is North Korea had started their marketization from cities to villages. Cities are always more developed than rural areas. And that reform had been moved to China afterwards, to rural area afterwards. So it will take few decades. So that will make the rural areas to follow urban areas all the time. The garden field management system had made some progress, and they are making planning measures. So without the central government managing the system, the local government can do the control. So some of the hierarchies had been changed. So what they need is just revision. They can get autonomy with the price management, and some of the powers had been empowered. So if they do the comparison, what is lacking? Economic special zone.
2013년부터
So starting from 2013, some of the economic development zone had been started, and this had been suggested. But there were some investment issues, so in 2018, some of the investment had been withdrawn. But if they compare it with China, legally, the economic zone is very big. But if they look at the policies, it is all about the coordination and agreement. So there is a paradox in between. Responsibility, the power of responsibility, and production responsibility. Family unit, they can manage a field. They can sell their produce. Now they have the right to do that. But this is not implemented in North Korea. This is very different from China. There were 9 different plans imposed: production and import, national obligation, land use expense, and efforts. So on site, it is not efficient enough. So that is why Kim Jong-un's regime will have to check this and make some coordination. And if there are improvements, this can be the plans will be implemented and it can be empowered. Thank you.
So I'm sorry because of time limit. We'd like to wrap up to, the first presenter's comment. I'd like to hear a comment from Professor Lee. So because of the time limit, I'd like to talk about one point about the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council had a discussion about the climate change recently, and actually climate change is a really controversial agenda and really important as well. Like from the perspective of the developing countries, the UN Security Council, like they can have the question, why do they have that kind of discussion? Because they're not related bodies. But we can have a different perspective, because the UN Security Council can make a great attention for the agenda because they were related with the traditional security approach. And of course, I'm against the end of the world perspective or the apocalypse perspective. However, if we have to find any positive effect, we are so immersed into the climate change issue. If they can step into those agenda, we can create more attention to the agenda. We can level up we can level up this agenda to the higher level of discussion. It is always regrettable that we are running out of time for this important factors, but sometimes I believe it is my lack of capability to facilitate this session in time. However, at the same time, we can think that we have rich and abundant ideas on this session, and that's why you are running out of time. So here I'd like to conclude today's session, and thank you so much for all the participants, including speakers and panelists. Thank you very much. So once again, please give a big round of applause to the chairperson, speakers, and panelists on this stage. So here we will have a short break and conclude this session. Thank you very much.